Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the second of a series of lectures on Shakespeare's Coriolanus. So we talked about the context of Coriolanus in the first lecture, the context being the Roman plays in terms of the plays that are directly connected to it. And those Roman plays, we said, are basically structured around discussions of what we could call the regime, the political arrangement of the political community. And we draw lessons today, and today meaning in Shakespeare's time, Elizabethan and Jacobean England, from the two fundamental forms of the Roman regime, the Republic and the Empire. So I'd like to expand on that today. So Shakespeare's Roman plays show the essence of the Roman regime both under the Republic and under the Empire. So in Coriolanus, we see the rise of the Roman Republic with individuals as honored, seeking, aristocratic warriors. We see that possibility, namely in Coriolanus. In Julius Caesar, we see the end of the Roman Republic with an individual who's far outpacing his peers in terms of power and foreign conquest. And then in Antony and Cleopatra, we see the beginning of the Roman Empire with the individual no longer driven by honor and the desire for conquest, but by passions, and no longer bound by traditional senses of duty to the common good, but more to individual erotic passions, or and pointing in some senses to the potential for spiritual passion. So the two regimes cultivate fundamentally different passions, the Republic and the Empire. There's an emphasis on martial valor and honor seeking that marks the Republic in cultivating the passion of anger, so to speak. And the passions are driven inward in the Empire. In an empire, my political aspirations don't find an outlet. There's really only one person who rules. My political ambitions are not going to have an outlet. So those passions are driven inward and results in the cultivation of different sensual desires that we see in Antony and Cleopatra. And we should note too that what we saw in the Aeneid is how Aeneas' piety is set against two aspects of madness or furor. There's the need to control his anger and rage on the one hand, and on the other, the need to control uncontrollable desire. So we can see this in the two fundamental characteristics of the leading characters in Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra. So Coriolanus and Antony are both at once like and unlike, according to Geoffrey Bullock, both victims of passion, but of very different passions. They exemplified the two complementary aspects of human nature defined by many ethical writers since Aristotle. For if Antony was a slave to the concupiscible forces, Coriolanus was at the mercy of irascible elements in his personality. They are indeed parallel portraits. So Antony is a slave to his desire, and Coriolanus is at the mercy of his enraging passion. So the two heroes develop contrasting sides of human nature. Each embodies the way of life characteristic of the regime under which he lives, says Paul Cantor in his book on Shakespeare's Rome. And in that way, the two plays provide a good contrast. One way in which they're a good contrast is let's say, the austere atmosphere of Coriolanus as opposed to the lavish, over-the-top atmosphere of Antony and Cleopatra. So when I think of austere here, I mean in terms of, in Coriolanus, there's very little representation of characters satisfying either a desire for food or other physical desires, whereas in Antony and Cleopatra, there are several banquet scenes. There's representations of the two lovers embracing and referring to their sexual desires as well. Antony and Cleopatra is an atmosphere of eroticism. Coriolanus is an atmosphere of the austere. I'll note there's one invitation to supper in Coriolanus, but it is refused by Volumnia. She says, I sup upon myself. That's in Act 4, Scene 2. One feast is referred to among the Volsces, and it's off stage, it's not represented on stage, and they don't have time to enjoy it before they rush off to war. You shall have the drum struck up this afternoon. 'Tis as it were a parcel of their feast, and to be executed ere they wipe their lips. So food and the ability to enjoy food is interrupted. It's either denied in the case of Volumnia or interrupted by war in the case of the Volsces. Another sense in which this austere atmosphere is represented is in the case of Coriolanus and his wife Virgilia. They barely appear to be married. There's no sensual or terms of affection that are really shared between the two. And in fact, the ruling deity in Coriolanus is the goddess of chastity, Diana, as opposed to in Antony and Cleopatra, it's Venus. Act 5, Scene 3, we see the following words: the noble sister of Publica, the moon of Rome, cast as the icicle, that's curdied by the frost from purest snow and hangs on Dian's temple, dear Valeria. So a longing or a desire implies a lack or a need. Coriolanus and Volumnia both assert their radical self-reliance. They are not in need of anything to supplement them. So a way to think about this too is in relationship to the three parts of the soul, first articulated in Plato's Republic, but made a staple of thinking in texts ever since. For Plato, there's these three parts: the appetitive, the spirited, and the rational. So the one is this physical desire, one more this drive for honor, and the rational part, a logical, rational drive within one, and represented in terms of the parts of the body by first the appetitive by the belly or the genitals, and the spirited aspect represented by the heart, the chest, and the rational, obviously, by the mind. And each in terms of what they love, what they pursue. And the first, pleasure, physical pleasure. The spirited aspect of the soul pursues honor and victory. And then the rational aspect of the soul pursues truth and wisdom. So each has a virtue: moderation, courage, wisdom, in that order, and a vice: greed, anger, envy, pride, sloth. So some examples in both Coriolanus and Julius Caesar, where characters refer to this republican desire for honor, the celebration of the spirited aspect of the soul. So Marcius, before he becomes renamed as Coriolanus, he denigrates the common soldiers for valuing the spoils after battle higher than honor. So they value eros over thumos, the appetite over the spirited aspect of the soul. He says, "See here these movers that do prize their honors at a cracked drachma." Brutus in Julius Caesar expresses a similar sentiment. He says, "Who is here so rude that would not be a Roman? Who is here so vile that will not love his country? As I slew my best lover for the good of Rome, I have the same dagger for myself when it shall please my country to need my death." And we see here a couple of quotes from Marcius and Cominius that express this sentiment as well. I'll I'll just refer to the Cominius quote here from Act 3, Scene 3. I have been consul and can show for Rome her enemies' marks upon me. I do love my country's good with a respect more tender, more holy and profound than mine own life. So just to stop there, the love of honor means risking one's life, being willing to take one's life in order to preserve honor. Honor is higher than mere existence, or perpetuating one's own existence. My dear wife's estimate, her womb's increase and treasure of my loins. So again, the desire, the drive for honor trumps all of those things, trumps preserving the family, the children, treasure of my loins. So Shakespeare's history plays highlight this aspect of the thumotic as a governing feature of heroic, politically driven characters. And we can see in the Roman histories how the focus on the political and the focus on the honor to be attained by by achieving much in the political realm, by conquering others, the focus on that declines as we go into chronologically through the plays. And I say chronologically in terms of the subject matter covered. So Coriolanus, early in the Republic, in terms of the subject matter, has the most references to Rome or Roman, as we can see on this chart. Julius Caesar, next in terms of chronology of subject matter covered, has fewer, and the lowest is Antony and Cleopatra. Already we're with Antony and Cleopatra in the days of the empire, where people are focused less on Rome now. Rome is not an object of where people can aspire to their greatest political achievements. They have to direct their energies elsewhere. So one question, though, so Coriolanus as a play presents honor seeking, presents, let's say, the political spirit in its highest form. However, the problem is the characters themselves, and Coriolanus most perspicuously, doesn't necessarily show that honor necessarily leads to a political spiritedness. So Coriolanus has a sense of his own honor, is driven by that honor, but that honor is for himself and himself alone. It is not directed to a common good. So he'll risk his death in battle for his cause, so to speak. And he says it's for the good of the country, but it's not necessarily so. He's willing to join any side in order to fight his enemy, Aufidius. So we could say that we see courage and martial valor in Coriolanus in service of his own passion or anger, not in service of the common good. He says in Act 1, Scene 1, they have a leader, Tullus Aufidius, that will put you to it. I sin in envying his nobility, and were I anything but what I am, I would wish me only he. Cominius says, you have fought together. We're half to half the world by the ears, and he upon my party. I'd revolt to make only wars with him. He is a lion that I'm proud to hunt. So he's saying there that if the world were divided and half the world at war with the other half of the world, if Aufidius happened to be on my side, I would switch sides. I would revolt against my side in order to be able to attack Aufidius. So this is a sentiment he actually acts out. Of course, he ends up joining the other side in order to make war on who turns out to be his enemy, his real enemy, let us say, are the plebeians. So again, this sense that the for Coriolanus, his his honor drives him to incredible military accomplishments, but not for a common good, not for a political end, rather merely to, let's say, his own self-aggrandizement. He's willing to sacrifice the common good in order to further his own interests. However, the plebeians display no civic attachment either. They expel the defender that Rome needs out of a desire to advance their own interests of their class. And the patricians, represented by Menenius and Cominius, as Coriolanus marches on Rome, which is not going to be good for Rome, he's marching on Rome and with the Volscian army, they relish this because this will enable them to prove a point, so to speak, with the plebeians. This faction of plebeians versus patricians, and Coriolanus kind of above both of that and really driving for his own honor, means that each is out for their own interests, not for the common good. So at this point, I'd like to just talk about republicanism in general and in Shakespeare, and how it was represented in Elizabethan England and Jacobean England at the time. So classical republicanism began to be reborn in Italy in the early years of the Renaissance, and then so too in Tudor England. And there's a number of good works on this. I'll refer to a couple in that footnote there. This classical republicanism is a theory that the best kind of society is one that promotes the common welfare instead of the interests of only one class of citizen. Okay, so this is we start to see, let's say, part of the problem presented in Coriolanus. Coriolanus is supposed to be this birth of the republic and the formation of this state that in its ideal form apparently is about common welfare and about looking to the common good without the interests of a particular class having total sway. But what we see are individual characters and classes within that society only looking for their self-interest. So this, I think, is the fundamental tragedy, and this is what, as we dig into more examples later in these lectures, we'll see is what we could call the tragedy of the political. So, as we said in our intro to the Roman plays, that the republic has, or classical republic is supposed to have a few key attributes. It's supposed to cultivate civic virtue. All of citizens are supposed to be cultivated in such a way that their virtue is understood as participating in the political life, as opposed to modern liberal republics. So modern liberal republics are ones where you don't have to necessarily participate in political life. Your freedom is expressed as your individual liberty to do whatever you want. In the classical republic, there needs to be a moral education based on a civic religion, again, distinct from a liberal republic. There to be small, uniform communities with a great deal of diversity would not be tolerated, and the idea is there that is in that way they can be cultivated in such a way that they can be directed toward a common good. And to note again that for Shakespeare, we don't seem to see this unified whole. We see diversity and infinite variety of interests, wills, and people. And that seems to be part of the beauty of people, of communities, of existence itself, is this infinite variety, he says. So the question of how to model modern governments on the Roman model. So remember, in the Renaissance, people are looking to the classics, they're looking to the Greeks and see great artistic and philosophic achievement, and they look to the Romans to see political achievement. And the question is, okay, what can we do how can we model our own governments in such a way that we are able to be as politically successful, militarily successful as the Romans were? And this is a matter of hot debate in Renaissance Europe, including in England. So King James the First, who's the monarch at the time of the writing of Coriolanus, and his son Charles both like to associate themselves with the image of imperial Rome. So their opponents in Parliament invoked the Roman Republic, obviously. Where, rather than imitating imperial Rome, where the monarch or the emperor should have sole uh, sole overarching power, let's imitate Republican Rome, where we could see a balance of power between consuls, and in England, parallel would be the monarch, between them and the Senate, and the parallel in England was the House of Lords, and the tribunes, and paralleled by the House of Commons. So in particular, this started in the 16th century already by these Commonwealth men who emphasized that the English monarchy was in many ways a monarchical republic, because de facto we had these different interests. The nobility, a nobility that had whose power and numbers had expanded under the early Tudor regime under Henry VIII, with the dissolution of the monasteries, and takeover of church lands. These were distributed to a new, broader gentry, and who now had, let's say, more of a contributing say to the political regime, the people writ large, as well. So there's this idea of the mixed regime of the republic, and of trying to imitate the Roman Republic in England at the time Shakespeare's writing. And the the idea was that Rome had, and its mixed regime had reached its peak around 200 before the Common Era. And this is the period that Shakespeare's Horatio in Hamlet refers to as, quote, the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little ere the mightiest Julius fell. So the question arises, was Shakespeare promoting the concept of republicanism in Coriolanus, or the Roman plays and the English histories more generally? And there's a variety of interpretations of that. So earlier in the century, he was mostly seen as conservative and supportive of an aristocratic or monarchical status quo. More recent, more revisionist accounts have tried to emphasize economic history and see Shakespeare as sympathizing with the role of the plebeians, and that he thinks that they should have more of a say. Some assert that Shakespeare is politically neutral. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge, for instance, says that this play illustrates the wonderfully philosophic impartiality of Shakespeare's politics. Similarly, these other two scholars, Leggett and Palmer. Others, let's say the revisionist reading that would see Shakespeare in Coriolanus as calling for more democratic or republican reforms, include Annabel Patterson in her book Shakespeare in the Popular Voice. She says, in Coriolanus, for the first time, Shakespeare's audience is invited to contemplate an alternative political system. So for Patterson, given the political movements of the early 1600s in England toward empowerment of the House of Commons, this seems a plausible position, who is attuned to his audience's interests. So Hadfield has let's say, a similar view. And these authors often refer to those Midland riots. Remember, we talked about these riots of the rural poor who were in 1607 due to food shortages, and this could be seen as echoed in the first scene with the rioting of the plebeians over the same cause. Now, those who assert that Shakespeare is conservative and that he's supporting an aristocratic or monarchical status quo, Alan Bloom, for instance, and this James Emerson Phillips. So I think for those who are positing that he's taking the side of the plebeians, I think they would have to explain, which no one has that I've seen. They would have to explain why Shakespeare changes his source, Plutarch, such that we call into question the legitimacy of the plebeians in their revolt at the beginning of the play. And why would Shakespeare make these changes in such a way that we end up, it limits our sympathy with their cause. So references to the causes of the revolt in Plutarch include excessive usury, the fact that there's also a reference to the fact that the plebeians had fought nobly in the war with the Sabines. All of that's removed. And the plebeians come off as ungrateful, as weak, cowardly, fickle, changing their minds. If Rome stands for the cultivation of martial, also another point, if Rome stands for the cultivation of martial valor, it seems only Coriolanus and the patrician class possess that virtue. With the, let's say, the exclusions that Shakespeare's made, the fact that he refers to the plebeians as weak, as cowardly, he doesn't refer to the fact that they fought nobly in the war. They come off as weak. They come off as not participating in what is Rome, if it's to be the regime that cultivates honor. So you could say that in terms of contemporary political statement, this aspect could be seen as appealing to the absolutism of James I. And as I said, I haven't seen good explanations of why Shakespeare would make those changes. Also, and as with many of Shakespeare's plays, the plebeians are presented as a, quote, fickle mob, okay? Their opinions are pliable. It depends who's just talked to them. And this is a quote from the third citizen in Act 2, Scene 3. We have been called, the many-headed multitude, of many, not that our heads are some brown, some black, some Abram, some bald, but that our wits are so diversely colored. And truly, I think if all our wits were to issue out of one skull, they would fly east, west, north, south, and their consent of one direct way should be at once to all the points of the compass. So even the plebeians themselves in that particular instance see that they are this fickle mob, a many-headed multitude. The different views, let's say, or the different possibilities for seeing what Shakespeare's doing here are reflected in theatrical history. So there's a long history of productions of this play that will present it as either supporting a very right-wing cause or a left-wing cause, so to speak, if I were to use those crude terms. So one of the first recorded performance by Nathan Tate, entitled "The Ingratitude of the Commonwealth," as we can see from the title he used there, which side he took. So this is in the heels of a royal restoration after the English Civil War and the Commonwealth that lasted up until 1660. And here, in the context of this restoration, we have a celebration of royal power in the face of any plebeian claims or republican claims that they should also have a say in the rule of the state. So he stressed the importance of the respectful loyalty and supported Coriolanus's complaints about the commoners of Rome and de-emphasized the hero's faults. So that was one interpretation. We kind of get a different interpretation in 1718 by John Dennis, entitled The Invader of His Country or the Fatal Resentment. And it refers to and critiques the 1715 invasion of Britain by the exiled Stuart dynasty. And then in the 20th century, Coriolanus productions have reflected the extreme ideological positions of the day. So, for instance, we get a pro-fascist production in France in the 1930s, and it was closed, and it had provoked kind of anti-fascist demonstrations to protest that play. In Nazi Germany, Coriolanus was taught in schools, and the protagonist was identified with Hitler as a model of firm leadership. And the injustice of his banishment was emphasized. After World War II, American forces banned the play until 1953. 1935, in the Soviet Union, production that stressed Coriolanus's treachery, so the exact opposite, and his aristocratic pride was seen by Stalin's protagonist as a excellent portrayal of the betrayal of the people by an individualistic leader. Similar take by Brecht, Marxist East German playwright. So in all these cases, what we see is the potential for various interpretations just based on the text. What we have is the text. We have to kind of piece that together and make some suppositions, but the text is rich. It has a variety, has an infinite variety, as do people, according to Shakespeare. And because of that, we get almost an infinite variety of possible interpretations. The question is of having to go to the text and make a logical claim, garner the evidence to support that claim. As I said, I think the extreme left-wing view, let us say, that Shakespeare is absolutely pro-plebeian, that it's about celebrating their rights. It has to, let's say, explain, which I don't think it can, the treatment of the plebeians and how they're shown as not having the sympathy that they do in the source material. On the other hand, the extreme on the right to say that Coriolanus, as per the productions in Nazi Germany, that he's a firm leader and that the people just don't get him. They have to somehow explain away Coriolanus's tragic flaws and his limited insights in terms of his dependence upon the people, the fact that he's too proud, and he himself too erroneously self-positing that he can't make himself one of the community, that he can't open himself to the community, he can't direct himself to the community. So I think there's limits to either extreme, and that Shakespeare seems to want us to go in some sort of middle path if we do look at the evidence. So I'm going to stop there. In our next lecture, we'll start to look at the Republican regime in Coriolanus. Thank you very much.